Hello, I'm Adam Parsons, standing in for Neil Patterson on the Sky News Daily. And today we're talking about Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who's died in the remote Siberian prison in which he was being held. Now, a succession of world leaders have come out to put the blame for his death squarely on the shoulders of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. Navalny's grieving wife, Yulia, has echoed that, saying she will continue his work. But all that rhetoric, all that outrage, I do wonder if it makes really any difference to Putin. He's got an election coming up. Spoiler alert, he's going to win by a colossal margin. And his control over the country seems stronger than ever. By silencing the only active opposition politician that most people, certainly outside Russia, have heard of, he might just have tightened that grip even further. So later on, I'm going to be speaking to a Russian political scientist who has herself been denounced as a foreign agent by the Kremlin. But first, let's talk to our international correspondent, Diana Magnay. She's in Moscow. So, Diana, when you and I spoke over the weekend, you were out in front of the headquarters of the FSB, the incredibly powerful security service. And yet right there, people were laying flowers in memory of Alexei Navalny. So how do you gauge the mood in Moscow now?
It's not a very comfortable environment at the moment, I've got to say. And it is just so weird that you're standing there in front of Lubyanka, at the heart of it. You know, that's at the heart of the security state, basically. And that is where there's this memorial to the victims of Soviet repression, because they were repressed by the then KGB. And now we're seeing that kind of repression from the FSB. And there are police all around who were perfectly civil, to be fair to them, and just wanted to see our documents. But then what I felt was a bit more sinister is just the unmarked plainclothes police or plainclothes security services who are just, they're masked and they are just filming you. And suddenly, as I was in the middle of my live shot to you, I could see that one of them started filming me. And then you A, get nervous, and B, hope that you don't say something that they can get you on. And it's not a nice environment.
We know so little in some way about the specifics of this, other than that Navalny's death and where he was. But let's try and dig into what we do know. I mean, for one thing, where is his body? Who's got it?
The authorities up there have it. They're just not going to give it to the family until they've covered up any traces of what may have happened to him. Poor Ludmila, who is the mother, has had to trawl around this small town in the Russian Arctic, from the prison colony to the morgue at the hospital, desperately trying to see her son's body, and the authorities aren't letting her. It's extraordinary. It's this additional cruelty when it is already cruel enough to lose your son like this.
And some suggestions that he was killed using Novichok. Now, clearly impossible to substantiate these things, but interesting that that's being mooted. This video that his widow has put out, Yulia, it's an incredibly strident, confident video from a woman who, I have to say, her poise is quite remarkable.
It is, and also she hasn't talked to the press, and suddenly she has taken on this mantle. And that video is really, really impressive for a woman who's grieving the death of her husband. And she's like, half of me has been killed, of my heart and my soul, but the other half is strong and is here with you to carry on his legacy. That's an incredible message.
Do you think, Diana, that this suggests a political profile? Is she going to just seize the torch from her late husband?
I think so, but the problem that she has is that she will be doing it from abroad, because obviously if you do it from here, we all know what will happen to you. And the reason that Navalny wanted to come back to Russia was because he didn't feel that you can lead a people or act as any kind of proper sort of symbol for the people from abroad. So I think that is the problem that she will face. And it's a brave and brilliant role that she's assuming. I just don't know that it will have all of that much resonance here.
But is it possible that Alexei Navalny on that front was wrong? That actually it kind of feels as if by putting him in prison, they did marginalise him relatively effectively, didn't it?
Yeah, of course they did. I mean, he still managed to get his message out through social media, through his lawyers, which I think they didn't like. But they did quieten him. And I suppose she will belong to a tradition of Russian dissidents who are trying to raise the alarm from outside of the country. And maybe it will have resonance. But I mean, until the majority of the Russian people take note and listen to her and think about what she represents and what he represented, I think it's an uphill battle. And he wasn't the sort of household name inside Russia that he has become outside Russia.
Is this a lightning rod, really, for the opposition in Russia? Because in a sense, this is the moment when they could coagulate behind a common cause. You could have mass protests all over the country, and we're not seeing them right now. If this doesn't bring people out onto the streets in their huge numbers, can we assume that pretty much nothing will?
So I think it's a big ask to ask people to come out onto the streets. And, you know, I'm often asked in the West, why aren't people in Russia protesting more? And I think, did you watch? Did you watch anything that me or any of us did over the past decade? Were you watching the television pictures? Did you see them arrest everybody? I don't think anybody in a free democratic country really knows and can feel what it is to have those basic freedoms taken away from you and to always in the back of your mind have that sense of fear about what the state could do to you. I don't think we know what that's like.
And you've spent many years living in Russia. I know you have a huge affection for that country, but right now, where is Russia? Does it feel like a more dangerous country than the one that you first moved to?
I think it's always been a dangerous place. I just saw a clip the other day of Margaret Thatcher talking about Putin and the way he handled the Kursk submarine tragedy back in the early days of his regime. And she said then, I was struggling to see an ounce of humanity in him. And that hasn't changed. And I think at the beginning of his tenure, he was trying to make inroads with the West, and those failed. But I mean, we saw how he acted in Chechnya. We saw the incredibly cruel way in which that he handled sort of key moments in the first decade of his rule. I think the writing was on the wall, but I do think everything changed with the war, and it is a very different Russia. But Russia's changed so much anyway, hasn't it? Look at its last century. Look at the 90s. Look at Putin's whole era. Who knows what will happen next?
Thanks, Dana. Now, Ekaterina Schulmann is a Russian political scientist and a teacher who was exiled from Russia in 2022. Ekaterina, according to the Kremlin, you are a foreign agent. What does that mean for your life?
It is a legal status that I share with hundreds of other Russians. Many of them are my colleagues, teachers, academics, scholars. Some of them are journalists. Some of them are regional civic activists. Some of them are cultural figures, writers, actors, etc. It prohibits me, for example, from teaching. A foreign agent cannot teach at a school or at a university. And it also virtually prohibits any sort of public activity because no public platform in the country will invite or accept a foreign agent because the restrictions and the penalties are so high. In bare terms, this status that infringes on my basic rights as a citizen and as a teacher, and effectively prevents my doing anything whatsoever in my own country.
And if you went back to Russia, would you be safe?
In practical terms, as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, there is no criminal case against me in Russia as yet. But criminal cases mushroom up overnight. That's a very quick thing to do. But the point for me is not safety, but ability or inability to do my work. There's no point in my being there where I can't do what I do.
I guess a fundamental question today is the death of Alexei Navalny also the death of any significant opposition in Russia?
That would, of course, be the immediate impression. The loss that we have sustained is so great and despite all the circumstances so sudden that the emotions of the first hours and days mostly consist of despondency and hopelessness. Alexei Navalny was so much an embodiment of hope. He was so much a man of the future that he believed in with a passion and I would say a certainty hardly shared to that extent by anyone else. That, again, our emotions are understandable. But again, speaking not as a citizen of Russia, nor as a contemporary of Alexei Navalny, but as a political scientist, I must say that leaders are created not by miracle of nature, but by societal demand. If there is a demand for an alternative to the bleak realities of today, if there's a demand for a different future, if there is a demand for change, this wave will bring up people who will answer to it. That's the basic political process. Demand creates supply, not the other way around.
But Ekaterina, if I look at that model, demand and supply is great, but then also if you have the apparatus of the state saying if you oppose us, you will either be dead or in prison or forced to live abroad, it's a very brave person who puts their hand up and says, actually, I still want to be an opposition leader and be here in Russia, isn't it?
That's correct. You can successfully terrify your people into inaction. And their dissatisfaction with the status quo will not be converted into any sort of political activity. But it doesn't make your people happy, and it doesn't make them love you the more. What is even worse for any autocracy is that this sort of continual policy creates fear and inspires inaction.
Ekaterina, thanks a lot to you. After the break, we're going to hear more about the upcoming Russian election and who might possibly turn out to be the winner. Vladimir Putin has dominated Russia's political system and the media for the past couple of decades, so it's hardly a surprise he's going to run for president again in March. So what can we expect? And could Alexei Navalny's death have any impact at all on the outcome? Dr. Maxim Alyukov is here. He is a research fellow at Manchester University and at King's Russia Institute. He's with us now. Maxim, in the light of the death of Alexei Navalny, is there really any coherent political opposition left in Russia?
There are definitely people who are critical of the regime, including those who are sympathetic towards Navalny. I would not say that it's a coherent group, though.
So what does an election look like now?
Elections in Russia are quite routine events. I don't think that many people perceive it as something which can bring about change, right? So even among regime supporters, there are many people who understand that it's a sort of staged, tightly controlled event.
So is it literally a question of somebody inside the Kremlin deciding should he win 96%, 97%? You know, is it that sort of PR exercise?
You have all these local polling stations across the country. You have to mobilize these people who do the counting, and falsifications, they typically happen not at the level of the Kremlin when they just come up with some number. It's much more sophisticated system when they give specific instructions to regional committees, to local committees, which are ordered to provide certain level of turnout and certain level of support for Putin.
We know that people came out onto the streets to support Alexei Navalny previously. We know that when Prigozhin launched his march, people were coming out to support him. Is the reality that there is a base level, significant opposition to Putin, but people are just too scared normally to express it?
Definitely, there is a significant group of people who are angry, who are sympathetic towards Navalny. You could call them opposition, but it's still a minority. And then there are significant groups who perceive that, who buy this propaganda line about him being the agent of the West, or there are those who are simply indifferent, right? So they want the situation to change somehow, but they are not engaged in politics and they don't do anything. There is still a group of people who are critical, but I would say it's a minority, unfortunately.
Maxim, I mean, you touched on it there, but the death of Alexei Navalny, the killing of Navalny, however we phrase it, many people will to go back to that point about the election, say, well, look, Putin was going to win this election. He always wins the election. He wins them by a landslide. Why bother putting all of this focus on the death of Alexei Navalny? Do you think this was a message really to his own people rather than worrying about the outrage from the rest of the world?
Yeah, I think so. There was no other reason to kill Navalny, right? So he's already in prison. Although he communicates with the public and still manages to give hope to some dissidents both inside and outside Russia, but he is not a threat. So if we assume that he was killed, and it's very likely that he was really killed, I would say that, yes, this is a signal sent to the opposition, which show them that the resistance is futile, right? So this is what I will do with anyone who can dare to oppose me. I can punish people with impunity. I can kill people. There is nothing you can do about it. So it's definitely a signal sent to the opposition to demobilize them. Because elections, again, even if tightly controlled, they can serve this as focal points of discontent. Still, you have this very large machine you have to control, and something can go wrong. And that's why when protest happens in authoritarian context, often elections serve as this pretext for protest. So if you assume that Navalny was killed, I would definitely consider it as a signal sent to demotivate those who are critical of Putin.
Are you in any way optimistic about the political future of Russia, or right now does it just look thoroughly bleak?
In the short term, yes, it's very, very bleak. But the fight is not over. So we just focus on this very short-term perspective. But it just sometimes takes decades for an autocracy to become a democracy, and there are ups and downs. Sometimes there's a process of democratic backsliding and so on. So in the short term, I don't think that there's anything which can be done about that, rather than, supporting Russian political prisoners, supporting Ukraine. But Putin is not eternal, and there'll be a moment for change.
I think there's a brutal truth here. Russia is an authoritarian dictatorship, and sometimes we forget just how oppressive that regime is. China, for instance, well, that's a one-party state. Russia, it seems, is a one-man state. And while some of the world now does voice its anger, that fury is coming from countries that, well, frankly, already loathe Vladimir Putin. Among his allies, well, I don't suppose he's lost any support. The Iranians, the Chinese, they're not going to shed any tears for Alexei Navalny. Well, that is it for today. Thank you for your company. Neil will be back tomorrow.